In 1958, Mao Zedong stood before the Chinese nation and announced a vision that would change the course of history. China, he declared, would not only catch up with the industrial powers of the West, it would surpass them. In a matter of years, the world's most populous and poorest nation would become a socialist utopia of steel, grain, and abundance. The campaign was called the Great Leap Forward. It was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it became one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. In the late 1950s, the People's Republic of China was still a young state. Less than a decade earlier, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party had emerged victorious from decades of civil war. The country they inherited was exhausted, poor, and largely rural. Most Chinese people were peasants. Industry was weak. Infrastructure was limited. But politically, Mao felt strong. He believed that China's revolutionary spirit could overcome material reality. The Soviet Union had shown that rapid industrialization under a centralized state was possible. Mao wanted to go even further. He did not want China to follow the Soviet model slowly. He wanted China to leap. Thus was born the Great Leap Forward. The plan was radical in both scale and ambition. Agriculture and industry would be transformed simultaneously. The countryside would be reorganized into massive people's communes, each containing tens of thousands of individuals. Private farming would disappear. Cooking would be collectivized. Tools would be shared. Daily life itself would become a political project. At the same time, China would produce steel on a scale never seen before. Across the nation, citizens were ordered to build backyard furnaces. Pots, pans, doors, tools, and even farming equipment were melted down in a frenzy to meet impossible production quotas. Officials proudly reported record numbers. Mao was told that China would soon outproduce Britain in steel. What he was not told was that much of this steel was useless. But in 1958, reality mattered less than enthusiasm. China was swept by a wave of political excitement. Propaganda posters showed smiling workers, endless harvests, and glowing factories. Newspapers announced miracle yields in agriculture, fields producing 3, 5, even 10 times their normal output. Local officials competed to impress higher authorities. To report modest results was to risk being labeled conservative or counter-revolutionary. So they lied, and those lies climbed all the way to the top. Mao toured the countryside and saw only what local cadres wanted him to see. Staged harvests, exaggerated numbers, carefully prepared villages. He became convinced that China had entered a new era of abundance. Based on these false reports, the state increased grain procurement quotas. More and more food was taken from the countryside to feed the cities and to be exported abroad to prove China's success. But the real harvests were not increasing. In many places, they were falling. The communes disrupted everything. Farmers were taken away from the fields to work on steel or massive construction projects. Traditional knowledge was discarded in favor of untested, scientific farming methods promoted by the party. Crops were planted too densely. Fields were plowed too deeply. Yields collapsed. Yet no one dared to say so. The political climate was unforgiving. The anti-rightist campaign of 1957 had already shown what happened to those who criticized the party. Intellectuals had been humiliated, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. Now, in the Great Leap Forward, fear ruled the countryside. When harvest failed, local officials still reported success. When granaries emptied, they claimed reserves were hidden by class enemies. When peasants complained, they were accused of sabotage. The system was now trapped in its own illusion. At the center of it all was Mao himself, a man convinced that willpower and ideology could overcome economic laws, climate, and human limits. He believed that mass mobilization could solve any problem. If production was low, it meant that people were not revolutionary enough. The answer was always more pressure, more campaigns, more sacrifice. By 1959, cracks were beginning to show. At a party conference in Lushan, a senior leader named Peng Dehuai cautiously warned that the Great Leap Forward was causing serious harm. Mao interpreted this not as advice, but as betrayal. Peng was purged. The message to the entire country was clear. Doubt is treason. From that moment on, the machinery of disaster could no longer be stopped. Behind the slogans, behind the banners and smiling posters, China was heading toward a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, would claim tens of millions of lives, and yet remain hidden, denied, and largely unknown to the outside world for decades. The Great Leap Forward was no longer a plan. It was a runaway train, and China was strapped to the tracks. By 1959, China was no longer a country chasing a dream. It was a country trapped inside a performance. Every level of the state, from village cadres to Beijing ministries, was now acting in a play whose script had already been written. The only rule was simple. The story must never change. The Great Leap Forward had created something far more dangerous than economic chaos. It had created a political system that could no longer tell the truth. Across China, the commune system had transformed daily life into a continuous political campaign. Work, meals, sleep, and even family life were now organized collectively. Private kitchens were abolished. People ate in communal canteens. In theory, this was supposed to free labor and increase efficiency. In reality, it destroyed responsibility. When food was everyone's, no one protected it. Waste became common. Rations were not linked to productivity, and when shortages appeared, there was no way to adapt. But the deeper problem was not organizational. It was political. The Communist Party ruled through targets, quotas, and slogans. Each level of administration was judged by the numbers it reported, and every number had to be better than the last. To report failure was to invite suspicion. To report success was to receive praise, promotion, and protection. So, success was invented. In 1958 and 1959, reports of miracle harvests flooded Beijing. Some villages claimed yields that were biologically impossible. Fields were staged for inspections. Grain was moved from place to place, so the same stock could be shown to multiple visiting delegations. Entire landscapes became theater sets. Mao believed these numbers. Or perhaps, more accurately, he chose to believe them. Based on these reports, the state increased grain procurement dramatically. The logic was simple. If harvests were exploding, the state could take more and still leave plenty for the peasants. In some regions, officials took up to 40%, sometimes more, of the entire crop. But the grain did not exist. In many villages, the granaries were emptied by the state, while the population was left with almost nothing. When hunger began to appear, local officials refused to admit the obvious. Instead, they searched for enemies. Peasants were accused of hiding food. Homes were searched. Floors were dug up. Cooking pots were inspected. In some places, families were forced to hand over seed grain, the very grain needed for the next planting season. The famine was not yet officially a famine. It was still called temporary difficulty, and it was always blamed on someone else. The political atmosphere was brutal. Cadres who expressed doubt were labeled rightists or opportunists. Some were removed from their positions. Others were publicly humiliated. Some were beaten. The memory of the 1957 purges was still fresh. Everyone knew the price of honesty. So the lies continued. The system now had a terrifying structure. False information went up. Real suffering stayed down. And the higher the lies climbed, the more destructive the policies became. Meanwhile, labor was being wasted on a colossal scale. Millions of peasants were taken away from farming to work on steel production, irrigation projects, and giant infrastructure schemes. Many of these projects were poorly planned, rushed, or completely useless. Reservoirs collapsed. Canals were dug in the wrong places. Entire harvest seasons were missed. In the countryside, fields were left untended, while villagers were ordered to feed furnaces with their own tools. The steel, when it came out, was often brittle, impure, and unusable. But the numbers looked good. And numbers were all that mattered. By late 1959, hunger was spreading quietly but steadily. In some provinces, people began to eat leaves, bark, and wild roots. In others, livestock disappeared. Then dogs, then rats. Local officials saw it, but they reported record harvests anyway. The central government continued to export grain to repay debts and to demonstrate China's success to the world. Even as villages starved, ships carrying Chinese grain left for foreign ports. The system could not stop. At the top, Mao still believed in the momentum of the revolution. He had silenced his critics. The party had committed itself publicly to the great leap forward. To admit failure would be to admit that the entire political line was wrong, and in Maoist China, that was unthinkable. So the country continued to perform. In village after village, people attended political meetings. While their bodies weakened, they marched in parades while hiding their hunger. They sang songs about abundance while quietly watching their children grow thinner. China was now a nation where reality and official truth no longer had any connection. The stage was set. The harvest of lies had been gathered. And soon, the real harvest would be death. There was no single day when China realized it was starving. Hunger did not arrive like a storm. It came like a long winter that never ended. By 1960, the illusion was no longer sustainable. Across vast regions of China, the countryside was collapsing. The commune canteens, once symbols of socialist abundance, were serving thinner and thinner meals. In many places, they closed entirely. People were told to fend for themselves, but there was nothing left to find. The famine was now real, yet the state still refused to call it by its name. Officially, the country was experiencing natural disasters and temporary economic difficulties. In reality, the catastrophe was overwhelmingly man-made. Harvests had collapsed. Labor had been seed grain had been consumed. Tools had been destroyed. But even now, the political machine continued to operate as if success were just around the corner. Grain requisitions did not stop. In some provinces, the state continued to take food even when local officials knew it meant condemning entire villages. To resist an order from above was to risk being accused of political disloyalty. Many cadres chose obedience over humanity. As a result, starvation spread with horrifying speed. People first sold their possessions. Then they ate their animals. Then they ate things that were not food. Leaves, grass, bark, clay. In some regions, historians would later find that entire ecosystems had been stripped bare. Families broke apart in search of survival. Children were sent away in the hope that someone else might feed them. Many never returned, and still the world knew almost nothing. China was closed. Journalists were not allowed to travel freely. Information was tightly controlled. Internally, even provincial governments often did not know the true scale of the disaster elsewhere. Each region believed it was suffering alone. The silence was part of the tragedy. The party's priorities were clear. Grain was still being sent to cities, to industrial centers, and in some cases, abroad. Urban populations were protected. The countryside paid the price. Within the villages, social order began to break down. Work teams continued to demand labor from people who were barely able to stand. Political meetings continued while people collapsed from weakness. In some places, punishment for stealing food or failing to work quotas became more brutal, not less. The state still saw hunger as a discipline problem. By 1960 and 1961, death was everywhere. In some regions, entire villages disappeared from the map. Local records, when they survived, showed death rates that were several times higher than normal. In the worst-hit provinces Anhui, Henan, Sichuan, Gansu, the countryside became a landscape of quiet abandonment. The tragedy did not look like a war. There were no explosions, no battlefields. It looked like empty roads. Gloseth, Ouses, silent fields. The true number of victims would remain unknown for decades. Modern historical research, based on archival records, demographic studies, and local documents, estimates that between 30 and 45 million people died prematurely as a result of the famine and related policies. Some scholars place the number even higher. It was, by scale, the deadliest famine in human history. And yet, for a long time, it did not exist. There were no national days of mourning, no official acknowledgement, no monuments. Families buried their dead quietly, often without markers. In many places, there were not even coffins. The party could not admit what had happened. To admit it would mean admitting that the Great Leap Forward, Mao's personal project, had been a catastrophic failure. Inside the leadership, however, reality could no longer be completely ignored. By late 1960 and 1961, some senior officials began to push for change. Policies were quietly reversed. Communes were loosened. Private plots were slowly reintroduced. Grain procurement targets were reduced, but these changes came too late for millions. The famine receded not because the system worked, but because the system finally stopped doing what it had been doing. Even then, there was no public reckoning, no trials, no official numbers, no apology. The countryside had been sacrificed in silence, and silence, in Mao's China, was not an accident. It was policy. When the famine ended, China did not mourn. It moved on quietly, deliberately, and without looking back. By 1962, the worst of the catastrophe had passed. The countryside was exhausted, traumatized, and permanently changed. The population had fallen by tens of millions, though no official figure would ever be announced. Fields were slowly replanted. Markets cautiously returned. Families that remained tried to rebuild lives from absence and loss. But politically, nothing resembling justice followed. There were no public trials, no national investigation, no truth commission. The Chinese state did not acknowledge that a famine had taken place, only that the country had suffered 3 years of natural disasters. This was not a mistake of language. It was a decision. Inside the Communist Party, however, the reality was understood. At a high-level meeting in 1962, President Liu Shaoqi would later state that the disaster was 30% natural, 70% man-made. This was as close to an admission as the system could tolerate. Even then, it was said behind closed doors. Mao Zedong's position inside the party was weakened, but not destroyed. He did not publicly accept responsibility. Instead, day-to-day economic management was gradually handed to more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. They introduced cautious reforms. Incentives returned. Agricultural production slowly recovered. For a few years, China stepped back from ideological extremism, but Mao never accepted this retreat. In his mind, the problem was not that the great leap forward had been too radical. It was that the party had not been radical enough. The famine was not framed as a warning against absolute power. It was framed as a temporary deviation from revolutionary purity. This unresolved tension would have catastrophic consequences again only a few years later. When Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, another campaign that would tear Chinese society apart, though in a different way. Meanwhile, the memory of the famine was buried. Archives were closed. Statistics were classified. Publications avoided the subject. Survivors learned quickly that speaking openly about those years could bring trouble. In a political system built on historical infallibility, some events simply could not be allowed to exist, so they were erased. Families remembered, but privately. Villages remembered, but without records. An entire generation carried the trauma in silence. It would take decades before Chinese and foreign historians could begin to reconstruct what had really happened. When provincial archives slowly opened in the 1980s and 1990s, researchers like Yang Jisheng and Frank Dictor found evidence of a catastrophe far larger than anyone had publicly admitted. The documents showed not only mass death, but systematic coercion, punishment, and state-enforced denial. The famine was not just a tragedy, it was a political crime. One of the most disturbing aspects was how preventable it had been. China was not struck by a global food shortage. There was no unavoidable natural collapse. The country continued to export grain during the worst years. The famine existed because information was falsified, because criticism was criminalized, and because ideology was placed above human life. It was not ignorance. It was a system. Mao Zedong remained in power until his death in 1976. His image was never officially condemned. His portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square. The party chose continuity over reckoning, and so one of the deadliest disasters in human history remains, even today, only partially acknowledged inside China. There is no official memorial for the tens of millions who died, no national day of remembrance, no public accounting. Yet the consequences of those years shaped everything that came after. They explained the Chinese leadership's obsession with stability. They explained the fear of chaos. They explained the deep, unspoken understanding of what happens when political reality becomes detached from human reality. The Great Famine was not an accident of history. It was the result of choices. And the most chilling lesson is not how many people died. It is how easily a system can make such deaths disappear.